Hello, welcome to the Wildline Podcast. I'm your host, Dan. This is a podcast about movies and how much money they make at the box office. Today, we're going to walk through the top 10 for April 13th through the 15th. We'll walk through the top 10, do a deep dive on some of the new wide releases like Rampage and Truth or Dare, figure out how they're going to play out long term. Talk a little bit about the limited releases that are out now. We'll check in with Isle of Dogs and see how that's doing as it expanded wide. And then we will talk about what's going to come up over the next few weeks at the box office. But let's do this. Let's dive into the top 10 for the weekend of April 13th through the 15th. These are indeed estimates. The actuals will be out tomorrow, but they're going to be pretty darn accurate. So let's do this thing. Before I announced number one, going into this weekend, as of Friday, Saturday morning, A Quiet Place was number one, expected to make in the low 30s. Rampage was looking like it was only going to do the high 20s, 28, 29. That's what it looked like on Friday after the Thursday previews and the matinee numbers as they came in. What ended up happening is both movies had really strong Saturdays, but Rampage really overperformed Friday night and Saturday, so it ended up leapfrogging A Quiet Place to come in at number one this weekend at $34.5 million. So Rampage is, of course, the action movie with Dwayne Johnson based on the, I guess it was an Atari video game. I remember playing it a long time ago. Me and my friend had this joke. This is probably 15 years ago. My friend had an Atari in his basement. We sat there and tried to play through all of Rampage. And I think the game just restarts. It starts in like Peoria, which is where I was born, actually. And like, it's just one of those old, really nerdy games that everybody who's over the age of probably 32, 33 has played before. So it had a built-in nostalgia factor to it. Did not necessarily lend itself to a big blockbuster movie, just because as someone who's played through the entire game multiple times, it's the same thing over and over again. And part of the joke with me and my friend was like, how long can we take this torture of playing this game where you're just like knocking down buildings and kind of just like button mashing for most of the time. So it didn't have the strongest kind of IP, but with Dwayne Johnson in front, it looks like a really hot property going into this spring, into this April. So it did open at 34.5 million. And so if we try to, contextualize this, is this good? Is this bad? A couple things to note. The production budget was $120 million. But, it also was a worldwide mass release. So I think whenever Deadline does their end of the year most profitable thing, it's so fascinating, because if you have not read that, if you're really fascinated about the box office and the profitability of films in general, do check out the Deadline top 20 most profitable films of the year. They've been doing it since 2014, I believe. So there's a few years of data, but what they do is they go in and break out how much it costs to make each movie, including the marketing cost for domestic and international. Domestic meaning the United States and Canada. That's what they call the domestic market in Hollywood. So my guess on Rampage, based on looking at those numbers in the past, they've gone really, marketing has just ballooned in a lot of cases for worldwide releases. You're looking at probably another $100 million on top of that. So baseline costs right now, we're talking $220 million to put Rampage out. So 34.5 million doesn't sound like a ton. It did beat its initial tracking and what we thought it was going to do going into the weekend. So if you view it microscopically to that, good performance, right? But I mean, when you take a little bit of a step back, it's like that seems kind of low for what was supposed to be a pretty big blockbuster movie. And then when you factor in the costs and the marketing, you're thinking, oh man, I don't know. How is this going to do? The key to Rampage and its performance is going to be international. How it does overseas. It's already looking pretty strong over there. Normally, a wide release blockbuster film, back like 15 years ago, it was usually split like about 50-50. 50% of its box office was domestic, 50 of it was international. That's really changed a lot. And certain movies, like another example would be like Furious 7, where a ton, I think like 80% came from international and 20% was domestic. I think Rampage is setting up to be one of those films where it's going to be about 30% domestic, 70% international. So it's going to be much more important how it does overseas than here in the States. Right now, the breakdown is 23% domestic, foreign is 76, 77%. So it does seem to be shaping up like more of a global international film. So depending on how it does overseas, we can kind of guesstimate here what it's going to do. So before we dive into that, let's talk a little bit more about how the film was received, right? So the opening was a little bit depressed, I think, compared to what Warner Brothers and New Line was looking for. I think they were looking for, when they conceptualized this movie, and probably about 6 months ago before the marketing kicked in, they were hoping for at least 40, definitely well into the 50. Remember San Andreas, another sort of same director as this, Dwayne Johnson in the lead, big action movie, kind of a throwback to the mid-1990s action movies, really mindless, like stuff blowing up and cities being destroyed. So this is kind of, intimately connected to that film. I think the thought process there was that, okay, it's going to open like San Andreas, which opened in the low 50s, I believe. So compared to that, it's not a successful opening, right? I mean, you're at least 20 million off what I think Warner Brothers was expecting when they greenlighted this movie, and with their fingers crossed, hoping they could break out into the 60s and 70s and on higher. So I think from that perspective, not the greatest opening. The reaction from critics, 50% on Rotten Tomatoes, so not great, but it is a mindless action movie. That's what you expect going in. Critics just aren't really great barometers for how successful those movies are, because they're looking at the artistic quality, and it's not about art if it's a mindless action movie. It's just about being entertained. So I don't think that tomato meter score holds much weight with the audience or how people are going to respond to it at the box office. Audience score on Rotten Tomatoes, take it with a grain of salt, 81%, so pretty high there. What's more impressive to me is the cinema score of an A-. So that's the in-person survey that people do. That is done when people leave the theater on Thursday and Friday. Actually, I think it's maybe just Friday these days. I think CinemaScore just does Friday at like 7:30 showing or something like that all over the country. So it's not just like one city, so it's skewed. They do it in like 15, 20 cities, something like that. So A- score from CinemaScore, which is surprisingly high to me. And it does kind of match up with that audience score at Rotten Tomatoes. So I think the response here from critics was definitely muted, but I think from audiences, they really enjoyed it. I think mostly because they knew what they were getting, and they thought they were going to get sort of another San Andreas, and I think they got that. Just whatever explosions, crazy stuff happening, and Dwayne Johnson, looking fantastic with, just like the strongman A-list, a movie star. And then the crazy stuff happening behind him. So I think that's sort of what people expected and what they got. So with that in mind, let's sort of project out what we think Rampage is going to do long term here. Keeping in mind that 34.5 million is pretty low for a movie like this, not great. So let's make a couple of assumptions. Let's assume, because the audiences kind of are enjoying this film, that it does, let's be generous and give it a 3x multiplier, because I do think the opening weekend was a little bit muted. That puts it at 103 domestically, which when you think about that related to the budget, it doesn't seem very high. Now, let's assume that that's domestic. It does seem to be weighed very heavily towards global. I'm going to give it the benefit of the doubt and say it does a third domestic and 2/3 of it will be foreign. So let's try and get a total take on the, I love doing math while I'm talking on the show. I'm sure you guys love it too. $312 million about worldwide. That seems a little bit low. Let's give it to like 320, 330. I'm going to say 330 is my guess for a global take. It could be much higher than this if it overperforms overseas. But let's just assume right now what we're seeing, $330 million total take. So in order for it to be profitable, So one formula that you can use, and this is based entirely on Deadline's data of the last 4 years, and I take it with a grain of salt if you want to, but there's no better data out there that exists. I'm telling you, there's a lot of people who think, oh, it's 2x the budget, or this. No. Like, you got to look through the data, get out your Google Sheets or Excel spreadsheets, type all the data in. This is what I do. And then figure out some patterns and some formulas that you can pop a movie into and see if it'll give you a ballpark whether it's going to be profitable or not. But in general, global box office, in order to get the revenue created for that film, you're looking at, for something big like this, you're looking at between 85 to 90% will be taken as revenue of that global box office. And that's just a relational formula. So let's assume it's normally towards like 85%, not as often towards the 90%. So let's assume like 87% of this is going to be revenue. So you're looking at like $290 million in just pure revenue coming in the door. Costs we already talked about, at least 220. So it could be a lot higher than that too. And this is over the entire life of the film. Like, this includes digital streaming, Netflix deals, TV, pay TV, DVD sales, all that sort of stuff is built into these models. I think it's going to break even and be a little bit profitable, but it all will really, really ride on the international performance. It's definitely, from what I see so far, from the data that we have now, it looks like it's going to do okay. It could do a lot better than this, but if the multiplier isn't great, it could drop down into the break-even sort of territory, where it would not be very successful at all. So I think the headline story is Rampage was number one, did $34.5 million domestically here in the U.S. and Canada. But the real story on this film is going to be its international run at the box office and how well it does there. If it overperforms there, I think it will be a nice little profitable film for Warner Brothers and New Line. All right, enough about Rampage. Let's talk about number two, A Quiet Place, the horror movie that came out of nowhere, it seems like, and has really broken out. And Paramount needed this film. Paramount needed a hit. They've been in severe trouble the last few years, and this is a perfect hit for them because it costs $17 million and it's just about to break the $100 million mark in its second weekend. So this weekend, A Quiet Place did $32.6 million, a fantastic 35% drop. It's not playing like a normal horror film, I think, is what's interesting to me. Normal horror films that pop off on their opening weekend and really overperform tend to have pretty massive drops their second weekend. Horror films in general tend to have low multipliers. That is, they tend to not make that much past their first weekend, right, proportionally to other films. So a normal horror film is going to drop at least 50% in its second weekend, probably, crossing over into the 60% range. Some are even higher than that, but A Quiet Place did not play like that. And so it's playing more like a word of mouth, big hit thriller, and less like a big sort of hypey horror film, if that makes sense. Very sort of two different tracks. I don't think these drops are going to get that much bigger than this. I see it dropping around 40% week in and week out for at least the first month here. Per theater average this weekend was higher than Rampage was this weekend. And Rampage obviously was opening at $9,100 per theater for A Quiet Place. And I'm gonna, I'll talk about. It's interesting to talk about horror films and where they're at right now. It's a topic that I talk pretty frequently about on the podcast because we're in this really interesting time period, sort of renaissance for horror films. And in number 3 this weekend was another horror film that opened up, Truth or Dare, from Universal and Blumhouse. Really Blumhouse production. The production budget on it was $3.5 million. It opened to $19 million this weekend. Per theater average was just about $6,300, opened in 3,000 theaters. And so I think Truth or Dare is probably going to play like a more traditional hypey horror film that is pops off opening weekend, significant drops. I see Truth or Dare dropping probably 55% next week, maybe even 60. Plays really well with the under 25 group. Quiet Place is playing better with over 25 quadrants. men and women, and I feel like it's going to have softer drops, and Truth or Dare is going to be your typical hyped horror film where it's going to have a low multiplier. And so it's worth noting that horror is in a really awesome place right now, really successful place. It's just they're churning out hits left and right. It's always been one of those genres that has been successful financially because they're shot for such little money, and they tend to make just enough to make a nice, sweet little profit for these studios. But now we're seeing stuff like A Quiet Place, where shot for $17 million. I guarantee you the marketing budget was not a normal wide release film. My guess is probably in the $30 million, $40 million cost for marketing of A Quiet Place domestically. A lot of it was probably social media, which is a ton cheaper than putting up a billboard or TV ad. Truth or Dare is probably the same. I did not see a lot of Truth or Dare advertising. It was mostly online. So these films are just they're profit centers, right? They're a way to get a film out there, shoot it for under 15 million, under 20 million bucks. In Blumhouse's case, it's micro budgets, which is why they've been so successful. Jason Blum, who's the founder of Blumhouse Productions, has really changed the ball game when it comes to not only horror, but I think film production in general. He has created a factory over there at Blumhouse where they can create movies. Most of their budgets, I believe, are under $5 million, and he does not write checks for any extras. Like I think he gets directors and basically says, you have $3.5 million and not a cent more. And so you do whatever you have to do to make this film work for that type of money. And so that puts them in a really interesting place for directors. I think that sort of that constriction helps some of them and sort of says, look, we can't do this big effects thing. We have to do this in a different way, and makes them be maybe even a little bit more experimental with what they're doing. But it's just like a very successful system over there at Blumhouse where they've figured out a way to shoot movies for under $5 million and have them open like Truth or Dare to $19 million. A Quiet Place is a little bit different of a path. The biggest reason why A Quiet Place is getting made is Michael Bay, surprisingly. The ultimate robot explosions guy. This was produced on the Platinum Dune sort of imprint within Paramount, and I know Deadline had a nice little breakdown of how this movie got made, but a lot of it came down to Michael Bay saying we have to make this movie, and him trusting John Krasinski to direct his first real big movie. Obviously, a famous actor, and his wife Emily Blunt played the lead. And they played the leads together. It was kind of a risky move for Paramount, and Paramount has had a couple of risks go poorly recently with Annihilation, giving Alex Garland $40 million to make this crazy sci-fi movie with an ending that is so bonkers that I wanted to turn off the movie, and I'm a sci-fi total aficionado. Even I couldn't handle the bonkersness. I was like, what is this? So that went poorly for Paramount. And then, of course, the famous Mother, Darren Aronofsky, with sort of horror, biblical horror, maybe what you could call it. Another total disaster with a cinema score of F. I mean, so bad that the negative PR was pretty incessant for Mother. So this is a win for Paramount on a lot of different levels, not just financially, but I think internally within that business and that studio. They needed something like this to happen to sort of prove out what they were trying to do and giving voice to new directors and new ideas. Like one thing that comes up very often when we talk about the box office is, proven IPs and original ideas, or as they say on Reddit constantly, OC, original content, right? There's a big struggle between those two. The proven IPs, intellectual properties, anything that, comic book movies would be a good example of this, or sequels. Those movies are doing very well these days, and original content has struggled. And Blumhouse has been another champion of original content. Like a lot of the stuff that they do, it's not a sequel to anything. They're just like, here's an idea, run with it. It's weird, it's crazy, just go for it. That's what Blumhouse is pretty much all about. And A Quiet Place, I think, is a little bit bigger example of that at Paramount. So both successful films. A Quiet Place is already crossing over the $100 million mark, which used to be like the ceiling for a really successful horror film. But ever since, like, I guess Get Out was massive, Split was massive. Those were both last year. God, it feels like 6 years ago. And then, of course, It in September, where it was just like unbelievable, open to over $100 million its opening weekend. Really, I think, changed the rules for horror films moving forward. So it's cool to see both these films do really well, coming in the number 2 and 3 slots for the weekend. Coming in at number 4 this weekend was Ready Player One, 11.2 million, with a hefty drop of about 55%. My guess is that these newer movies, Truth or Dare, Rampage, and the overperformance of A Quiet Place are taking away and siphoning off the Ready Player One audience. That is a pretty high drop for a third weekend. It did lose about 570 theaters. Per theater average this weekend was $3,000 per theater for Ready Player One in its third weekend. It currently sits at $114 million. Quiet Place is going to beat it easily. And if you told that to somebody like 3 months ago, they'd be like, "There's no way that A Quiet Place, this tiny little horror film, is going to beat Ready Player One, this massive sci-fi epic from El Spielbergo." Like, it just wasn't. I don't know. It's weird how things play out. Like, Ready Player One has not necessarily flopped, but it has not met the expectations, I think, of Warner Brothers. Again, international markets might help it out a lot. I think it's going to play very well on TV and streaming and digital release. It just did not pop off like I had really expected it to do. I thought it was going to open in like $60 million, but opened in the 40s, low 40s. So not a great weekend for Ready Player One. We'll see how it plays out over the next few weeks, but I'm not, I don't think Warner Brothers is that happy about this performance right now. Speaking of not being happy, number 5, Blockers, from Universal, 50% drop, which is okay. $10.3 million on the weekend, added 39 screens, or theaters, I should say. Per theater average was $3,000 per theater. It's in its second weekend. I did not really pay attention to the performance of this one last weekend. I know I talked about it, but I think I just forgot about it. Seeing it now, this is not great. Like, it was shot for $21 million, so it wasn't super expensive. But it only sits at about $37 million right now. I don't know. I thought this one was going to play a lot stronger than this. I thought it was going to open, well into the 20s, and it should have been, probably well past $40 million by now, maybe even end up in the $60 million range. That does not look like it's going to happen, unfortunately, for this film. I don't know what happened here. I feel like, it's a rated R comedy. John Cena, and who was the other lead in this? Now I have to double check. It looked really interesting, and the response was great from critics. 82% in Rotten Tomatoes. I mean, how strong? That's a super strong thing. But only 50% from audiences. What did it do on a cinema score? A B. So I think there's something happening here, and it kind of a higher drop for a second weekend for a film like this. Because if, we need to put into context, a really strong Rotten Tomatoes score like that, I would assume it would drop in like the mid 40s, low 40s. But I think there's a discrepancy between what critics are thinking about this movie and what the audiences think about this movie. And the audiences don't like it that much. A B cinema score for a movie like this, not good. And the audience score on Rotten Tomatoes, whatever, grain of salt, of course, as always, is really low. It does not match up at all with what critics thought about this. So I don't know if it was mismarketed or it's just, written, maybe too highbrow for people. I mean, how could it be highbrow? It's called cock blockers, essentially. But there's just a disconnect there, and the numbers are sort of playing out that disconnect. It's like something's not sitting right with the audiences on this one. And I wonder if it's negative word of mouth that is affecting these numbers. I'm not really sure, but it's not a fantastic performance. It's not really a flop, I would say. Going back to baseball metaphors, it's more like a single. right? It's not a double. It's definitely like a flop single to center field or something like that. An okay sort of performance here for blockers. I was really hyped that rated R comedies were going to come back strong, but I don't know. Let's stumble in a bit here. Okay, so number 6 this weekend was Black Panther, 5.3 million, fantastic 39% drop, just will not stop. Lost a lot of theaters though, about 570 theaters. Per theater average is still doing okay in its 9th weekend, $2,400 per theater. Total take so far for Black Panther is $673 million. I talked about this recently. Black Panther is now number 3 all time domestically at the box office. The only 2 movies ahead of it are The Force Awakens and Avatar, which of course no one saw coming at all. Worldwide take so far for Black Panther is a very strong 1.3 million. Kind of interesting though, the domestic percentage of that 1.3 billion is 51%, which very, very high for a massive movie like this. So it, obviously way overperformed in the US and Canada. And the foreign markets were strong, but not nearly as strong as it played here in the States. So I don't know what the deal is with Black Panther. I mean, I guess it's gonna play until the new Avengers comes out in a couple of weeks. And then I guess it'll disappear a little bit quicker than it is now. I'm surprised it's still in 2,100 theaters. It's crazy. But fantastic performance of Black Panther. But I've talked about that movie about 1,000 times on this podcast. We're moving on. Number 7 this weekend was the wide expansion of Isle of Dogs from Fox Searchlight, Wes Anderson. We talked about this one a lot in Limited. Did $5 million on the weekend, added 1,300 theaters. Per theater average was a strange $2,500. Not that much higher than Black Panther in its 9th weekend. This is the first week this film has been over 1,000 theaters. It's 4th weekend so far. Total take so far for Isle of Dogs is 18.4 million. So when I read this on Deadline, they made it, I don't know what it is about this film. They made it seem like this was a really good performance and that it was tracking, how would they say, about like a quarter below Grand Budapest Hotel, which is his biggest film. He ended in like the high 50s domestically at the box office. Here's what I see. I'm not like a super expert on this, especially not limited releases going wide. Even though I track all this stuff, it's hard to read sometimes. Here's what I'm seeing. And I will, before I say anything, audiences apparently love this film. I don't know if it had a cinema score yet. It didn't before. Maybe they'll do it next week. Yeah, they don't have a cinema score for this movie yet. Maybe let's check out what's going on Rotten Tomatoes real quick. 91% obviously from critics. I mean, critics, they love Wes Anderson. I mean, I love Wes Anderson. I love everything he does for the most part. I'd give everything he does like 100 out of 100. But that doesn't really translate necessarily to financial success at the box office. Audience score is 87% on Rotten Tomatoes. I'm assuming its cinema score, once they ever do it, is going to be pretty darn high. Here's my concern, though, as I'm looking at this, at the numbers. It's only in 1,900 theaters. That is a wide release, but a normal wide release is 3,200 up on through 4,000 theaters. So it's not even at a super wide release yet, and its per theater average is not that high. $2,500 on a wide push like this, it's not great. But it is relative. It's a Fox Searchlight movie. I have no idea how much they spent on making this. My guess is probably in the $20 to $30 million range, maybe higher. But anybody who says that this is overperforming or breaking out, I don't see it in that per theater average. If it was like $4,000 per theater, I might say something different, but $2,500 is not that much. And like, it's the perennial problem with, artier films expanding. They are beloved in cultural big cities like New York, San Francisco, Chicago, Los Angeles. But as you get further and further away from those places, those same films just don't have the same draw in other cities. And I feel like Isle of Dogs is running into that problem. It's a super weird movie. I haven't seen it, but then when you see the trailer, it's not a normal kids movie. It's Wes Anderson playing around with, puppets and whatever it is. I was just like claymation. I don't think it's claymation. Or stop motion is what I mean. That's what it is, stop motion. And so, yeah, I don't know. I'm not very impressed by it, to be honest with you. This was definitely Wes Anderson's most palatable film for mass audiences. Grand Budapest is still pretty weird. And I think Fantastic Mr. Fox, I forget how well that did, but this seemed like this could have been one of the big breakouts for Wes Anderson. I just don't think it's going to happen. I don't think it's going to play well in the outside the major cities. So we'll keep track of that one, though. Number 8 was the Christian mega hit I Can Only Imagine. $3.8 million for the weekend. A surprisingly high drop of 50%. This thing was dropping super low the last few weeks. Lost about 340 theaters. Per theater average was 1,500. Yeah, it's really losing steam right now. That happened very quickly. I guess all the Christian people saw the movie and now there's nobody left. It's only in its 5th weekend. I don't know. It was made for $7 million. It's already at 74 million. Based on the last couple of weeks, so the trajectory for this thing was to fly into 100 million. But it's getting cut down now for whatever reason. I just think it played so well, but that audience has been saturated, and there's no one else to see it. So that was number 8. Number 9 was Tyler Perry's Acrimony. 3.7 million, high drop, 56% drop. Third weekend, lost 600, almost 700 theaters. Per theater average was $2,800. Total take so far for Acrimony is $37.8 million. Not really a great performance for this film. Marketing was all over the place. It didn't seem very focused to me. What was the product they were selling with this movie? Just didn't feel like it connected well. And I think that performance sort of bears that out. Number 10 was Chappaquiddick from Entertainment Studios. I love that name of that studio. Entertainment Studios. $3 million for the weekend, 47% drop. Added 85 theaters. Per theater average was just about $1,800. Total take so far is $11 million for Chappaquiddick. I don't think they could have asked for anything better than that. Really weird film. Doesn't make any sense to put it out now. Who's Ted Kennedy? Anybody under the age of 30 has no idea who Ted Kennedy was. Obviously not as famous as Robert or John. So I don't know. I mean, not saying he's not an important historical figure. He's a massively important historical figure. It's just from a movie marketing perspective, what was the play here on this movie? So I think $11 million in its second weekend is honestly a fantastic performance when all things considered for that movie. What else? At 11 was Miracle Season. This is another Christian film. Has not played very well. To 2.1, 46% drop. Sits at about $7 million. I guess Beirut opens. I don't really know this one. I read an article about it. So yeah, John Hamm, Rosamund Pike, I believe who's the writer? Tony Gilroy, I think, maybe? I'm making that up right now. I don't know, 78% around Tomatoes. I don't know that much about this movie. It looks fascinating. But I don't know what's going on with this. 1.6 million from Bleecker Street. Bleecker Street has they're new and they're trying, and they're doing okay. They don't have a lot of hits under their belt yet. And this is kind of another example of a miss. Only did $2,200 per theater on 755 theaters. Just over, it sits right now at over $2 million. So Beirut, kind of like one of those films that no one's going to remember in about a week. And that's mostly it. I don't think there's anything else. The Rider came out from Sony Picture Classics. limited release in 3 theaters, did $15K per theater. That's not good for a limited release. So that's going nowhere. Lead on Pete expanded to 18 theaters total. Per theater average is terrible, $4,300. I thought that would do a little bit better because it looks so good. It's from A24. It's got to be good. Come on, guys. Death of Stalin stalled out at $6.3 million. An interesting film I just heard about. I can't believe I didn't hear about it before. You Were Never Really Here. Joaquin Phoenix from Amazon Studios. Kind of a dark drama. Director was Lynn Ramsey, who did, God, hasn't done much recently, but she was like a big name for a while. Kind of like an art house director. So You Were Never Really Here did $324,000 per this weekend. Per theater average was $6,000 per theater. Not great again. Limited releases. I don't know what the deal is with them. The industry's got to figure out a solution, right? Like, a lot of these limited movies just are not going to make a lot of cash in the box office, and it costs way too much to market them. It doesn't cost, obviously, to do prints and to send it all over the country. That's not a problem anymore. It's all on a USB stick. But like, trying to release a movie like You Were Never Really Here in 51 theaters, like, what's the point? Like, they've made $500K so far. I'm sure they spent way more than that trying to get this thing out there. So I don't know. Limited movies are kind of still in a very strange place. Okay, so that was the top 10 and some sprinkled in limited release stuff. Let's talk a little bit about what is coming up over the next couple of weeks. I Feel Pretty is coming out this weekend. Amy Schumer from SDX Entertainment. One of the worst marketing campaigns I've ever seen for a wide release. I have no idea how this thing's going to do. Who's going to go see it? What the hell is it about? Nobody knows. It's a mystery for all the wrong reasons. So I don't think it's going to do very well this weekend. Super Troopers 2 is coming out, of course, to celebrate 420. I think that's mostly it. Ghost Stories is coming out on IFC. I don't know much about that one. And all the other limited release stuff doesn't look too big. Traffic's coming out from Lionsgate. It looks like a straight-to-VOD movie. Not going to do very well at all. So not a very crazy April upcoming weekend. And then what do we got coming up after that? Of course, Avengers, April 27th, the massive one. No idea what this is going to do. You know, there's chatter all over the place with Avengers Infinity War. It's going to be super long. My theory was that Black Panther overperformed so much that it might take away some of the extra audience for Avengers. That would put it, you know, in the 220, 230 million opening weekend. I kind of stick by that read on this movie. I feel like the big decision is this thing, or the big sort of debate, is this thing is going to open over $200 million? And, you know, Black Panther did. So I don't know. I mean, this is the culmination of the MCU, right? So you would assume, based on that, you would assume that, oh yeah, well into 200 million. How can it not beat the original Avengers when they opened at 212? But there's a part of me in my gut that says, I don't know how. It's going to be a huge film. It's going to be an event film. It's going to print money for Disney. They're going to make like $300 million of profit on this movie at least. We got another one coming out next year. My gut says, though, that people are getting maybe a little bit tired of all this MCU. Just a little bit. Not a lot. I think they're just getting overwhelmed. You know, Black Panther was certainly an event film, one of the biggest films of all time. And now we have another one like a month and a half later. I just feel like people are going to be a little bit sleepy-eyed about this and not that excited. So my guess is probably high 100s, 180, 190. It might break 200, but my gut says that it won't. But I've been massively wrong before. And I don't think the multiplier is going to be great on it. And now if it's an amazing film, 90% Rotten Tomatoes, you know, A+ on Cinema Score, of course it's going to make like $600 million. But I just don't see that happening right now. Based on what I see now, I think high 100s, maybe 2.7, 2.6 multiplier. If it's lucky, maybe 2.5. And that's the end of April. What a strange April. A Quiet Place. Who thought A Quiet Place was going to be like the story of April? But it is. It's turning out to be that case. Avengers is essentially the start of the summer movie season. So we're now transitioning out from spring over into summer. And then, of course, we hit May here in a couple of weeks. There's not a ton opening the first weekend in May. Tully won't be very big at all. A couple small films. God, it's really quiet. Breaking In, Life of the Party on May 11th. Deadpool 2, I think, is the next big one. And then, of course, Solo the week after. Man, it's the box office is getting really strange. It just feels like, and I mentioned this a few times on the show, it feels like that nightmare scenario that people talked about 20 years ago is coming true, where there's no space at all for small films. And I say that as A Quiet Place just did fantastic, but it's definitely the exception. There's not a lot of space for independent art films at all anymore. And there's not a lot of space for mid-tier films anymore. It's becoming increasingly apparent that the movie theater exhibition industry is focusing on big blockbuster films and ignoring everything else. And I think from a financial perspective, that makes a whole lot of sense. If you look at this year and how the box office has done, it's actually been it hasn't done very well at all. But it has been especially bad if you took out Black Panther, which overperformed so much. The reason why we're neck and neck with last year is because Black Panther did triple what it was supposed to do. You know, it did $600 million instead of $300 million. And that difference is why we're even now with last year. If Black Panther didn't happen, then we'd be pretty far off from last year. So it would be a pretty dire situation. But I'm looking at May, and I'm just seeing, you know, a few massive movies and nothing else. And then June kind of seems similar. Just, you know, a handful, maybe 2 or 3 massive movies and not a lot to support it underneath. So we'll see. I don't know if the box office is it's becoming a popcorn blockbuster only affair, which I think was bound to happen eventually, but it's happening a little bit quicker than I thought it would. In any event, folks, that has been the weekend. Thanks for listening. I will be back next weekend. This has been the Wildline Podcast.